This is Newth Morris, and you're listening to the Matt Balaker Podcast.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you once again for tuning into the Matt Balaker Podcast. It makes me feel warm, fuzzy, and purposeful. And if you guys want to earn extra credit, like I know you do, please hit the like, subscribe button. I don't know, actually there's two buttons. There's one like, one subscribe. You don't have to smash it. Just click on it gently. That will suffice. I love you all. And as a gesture of my affection for you, I have an amazing guest today. I've been working to get this guy on for quite a while, and I'm glad my diligence has paid off because he's a skilled snowboarder and a heli skier. He's a doer of things and a fan of the Internet of Things. He's created businesses and shared his kegerator with me, which I am forever grateful. So thank you. And now he's embarked on a new path as a venture capitalist. Please join me in welcoming Newth Morris to the program. How you doing, Newth?
Doing well, Matt, and thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
The pleasure is probably 90+% mine because I've known you for years, but this is a chance to kind of dig deeper. So you grew up in Maryland, and I want to know, Newth, what makes a decent crab cake in your opinion?
Lump crab and no cornmeal. So if you could totally, my wife Claudia, first time we went out dating, went to a restaurant somewhere and it advertised Maryland crab cakes. I was like, I'm not trying it, and she's like, you're a snob. And then finally, she went home with me to Maryland and saw what a real crab cake is like. It's mainly crab and the smallest bit of like egg yolk to keep it together.
Okay, so just enough binder to prevent it from falling apart. And what is it about the Northeast crab that is so much better than most of the world, Newth?
Well, it's warm water. So if you know about seafood, like relatively warm water, the more the warmer it is, you tend to have more flavor. And this holds true to oysters as well. Warm water versus cold water oysters. Maryland has a blue crab, which it's partly the taste of it, but partly just the labor of love you have to go through to pick it all out. There's a lot of shells, a lot of work, so it's not as easy as like a stone crab or something like that. So it takes hours in the craft of just getting the meat out.
So I think this is very telling, Newth, because you're showing, the more work you put in, the sweeter the crab meat, so to speak. If it's just presented, easily, you might not appreciate it as much.
100%. If we can digress, I've got an interesting story on Maryland crabs. So you might have heard of Phillips Seafood. You'll see some frozen stuff here, and if you travel back east, they're in the airports and stuff like that. Steve Phillips lived in Baltimore, was a friend of my father's, and they were just kind of a little seafood shack out in the Eastern Shore. And in the 80s, the bay was pretty polluted and they're running out of crabs. And he was somewhere, or someone told him like, hey, these look a lot like the crabs they have in Indonesia. And he got on the airplane, and sure enough, there was a kind of a Delta type crab there, looked very similar. And Indonesia is a Muslim country, so they don't eat shellfish. And so he set up a bunch of imports and eventually kind of imported blue crab from Indonesia to the U.S. And so if you get real crabs, they typically come from the bay, the Chesapeake Bay. But a lot of the frozen stuff is actually Asian crabs that are imported and printed with kind of Maryland-style crab cakes.
You are a wealth of knowledge, Newth Morris. I have a deeper appreciation for crabs, both foreign and domestic. So thank you for that. And so you grew up in Maryland. You enjoyed the fine seafood there, but you went to school in Colorado. What motivated you to attend school in Colorado?
Yeah, so I'll rewind a little bit. My name is actually Arthur Newth Morris the Fourth.
The fourth, okay.
The fourth, yeah. And even though the name sounds like a royal name, my great-great-grandfather came over as kind of like a classic American. He was dubious background over to England, got in trouble somewhere, so he got on a ship. His name was George Edward Newth. He landed in Philadelphia, and for whatever reason, he needed a new name.
We
and
don't have to
he
get
picked
into
more.
details. Yeah.
There's some journals floating around and definitely some family lore. But he landed in Philly and picked a name off of a public house, a bar, named Morris. And Morris is a famous name in that area, signer of Declaration of Independence, etc. Not related to me.
Okay.
But he dropped that and went by George Edward Morris for a number of years. Then named my great grandfather Arthur Newth Morris. So he put the Newth back in there. My great grandfather was an entrepreneurial guy and started a business that's still around today that does paperboard packaging. So boxes, think like cereal box grade. So kind of they do corrugated now, but more print heavy type consumer packaging. And so when I was growing up, and my dad inherited a part of the business in Baltimore. So when I was a kid, I grew up working in a box factory in Baltimore, feeding machines and all that kind of stuff. And then I was told from pretty early on, you're going to do what we do. We always do the same things. You got the name. And as part of the name, I got to go to military school in Virginia. And the hills of Appalachia.
Wait. Slow down there, Newth, because, at least to me, you seem, relatively well adjusted, but you still went to military school in the Northeast. Like, do tell.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting. So this is the 80s and the military schools. I've learned a lot more about this in recent years. Military schools were in relative decline. I think there was a fallout after the Vietnam War, and we're in kind of disrepute. Some of the more kind of prep schools, you think like Blazers and that kind of stuff, were still around, but the military schools were kind of really hurt. And in fact, our former President Trump went to a military school that we played football against that's no longer around. I heard it's owned by the Chinese, which is kind of weird. But so in general, and then that coupled with the fact that Appalachia in the 80s was not super hot, kind of really depressed. In fact, the military school I went to backed up to a Superfund site that they were on the Shenandoah River that they were in the middle of cleaning up. But one thing in terms of being well-adjusted, it was an Air Force junior ROTC school. So we wore blue. I think we had a rifle team, but we didn't march with guns really. And they geared us up to serve that branch, which was kind of more educational and whatever, kind of than some of the traditional branches are. So kind of as a result of that, of having kind of worked at a box factory and going to military school, I was like, I don't want to, this might not be the path for me. So much, yeah, you can imagine why.
The sirens weren't singing their sexy songs of box manufacturing and marching with fake guns.
Exactly. So I was like, I think I want to do something else. And so I kind of looked around, and one of the schools that came across my attention was Colorado School of Mines. I was good at math. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but engineering seemed like a no-lose proposition. And applied to Colorado School of Mines. I played lacrosse at the time. They were building a lacrosse program. So I got a kind of a small scholarship to play lacrosse there. Would not have been able to play on the East Coast at all, but I managed to slip in to that program. And most of the other schools I looked at were up in New England, like somewhat types of schools you can imagine. And then went out and saw the School of Mines campus, which is in Golden, Colorado, where they make Coors beer.
Yeah, Coors USA. Go ahead.
That's it, and it's right in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And I'd never been west of the Mississippi before, and so the first time I saw like the sunset over the Rockies, my mind was just blown. I was like, "Wow, this is just amazing." And the school, I sat down with the admissions counselor, and they're like, "Well, you realize like 60% of our freshmen fail out, and all these other kinds of things." And I was like, "Well, I could do that. I'll take the challenge." And so I think my dad thought I was crazy. I didn't want to go work for him. He went to school in Florida, close to the beach, and I'm sure had a great time. But I was like, no, I kind of want to do something different. So I ended up going to the School of Mines.
Yeah, I have a friend from high school who went to the Colorado School of Mines for 1 year. Super smart, very nerdy engineering guy. And then bolted, I think, for Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I don't know all the reasons behind it, but it kind of fits the mold. It takes a certain mindset to excel. What say you, Newth?
Yeah, there's a couple things. So when I was there, probably a similar era to your friends, you would go into one of your first classes, and they'd say one of the things they'd say, they're very proud about this. look to your left, look to your right, say goodbye because they're not going to be here next year. And they had a class that was really famous called Physics 2, which was like electromagnetic physics, and it had like a 70% first time failure rate. And if people that have passed were like graded dramatically on a curve. And the final exam was something crazy, is like derive the force exerted on a point charge by a toroid electron field in space. You may assume a perfect vacuum. And that was like the final exam, right? Now, the point of all this, and another thing I would say there is like, look, our job is not to. They kind of had a kind of a little guys competition with MIT and all those other places, but they'd say, our job is not to teach you how to do stuff in a lab coat. Our job is to teach you how to save your coworkers on an oil refinery when it's on fire. So, because they're it was big into mining and petroleum and all these other things where you worked with a lot of things that could kill you. And so there's kind of really rough and kind of a tumble, really applied engineering, but really fun school. Downside, there were not a lot of women there, as you can imagine.
I'm doing a little demographic research in my head. Not generally the place for ladies. Things may have changed. Yeah.
No, I think even still, until they open up the teacher college next door, it's probably it's probably going to be about the same as it is. I think the demographics have changed a little bit, but it meant that if you went to Boulder or you went to Denver, you were on a mission to have a fun time. So we managed to do all right.
Good for you. Yeah, I think even if you're studying hard, if you're a stone's throw away from the Coors Brewery, you can have a good time. So unlike a lot of people, including me, you learned some tangible skills in college. How did you apply those to the real world, Newth?
Well, it's a couple things, but just in general, hard sciences, 2 semesters of differential equations. Some of the softer things, sociology and finance, you can kind of pick those up and do those later. But you're not really going to study differential equations on your own unless you're like some kind of math prodigy.
No, I want to pause briefly because I think you hit on an important point. Like, you only have so much time to kind of learn a craft. And I think there's this kind of choice a lot of people have to make. Do I want to do what I love and as like kind of a social enrichment with college and just higher education in general? Or do I want to do something where I can give myself an opportunity to make money and support my family? And I'm of the belief that you can always go to the library or buy a book on Shakespeare. You can listen to Beethoven, but it's hard as a middle-aged person to then pick up a calculus book and learn engineering. So go ahead.
No, that's exactly right, and it's kind of the path that I took because mines had liberal arts requirements, but they were literally like liberal arts 1, 2, and 3 is what you took.
Like finish it as fast as you possibly can.
Yeah. So, but it was a good environment. And I think in terms of what it taught you and what they would say is that you learn stuff, but it taught you how to learn. Because you get the basics of these things. And it's like, wow, I need to bone up on this skill, this topic, and then from there you can focus yourself and figure out how to go learn other things.
So you boned up, you learned other things. And I think shortly after college, you started your own enterprise. What happened there?
I did. There was a segue. So when I got done, I graduated in 1996. Oil was $9 a barrel when I graduated. So think about what that is now.
It's like the price of a gallon almost in California, but yeah.
That's exactly right. And so while everybody did get jobs, they were, you're going to Saudi, you're going to the North Sea. Like a good job was 3 weeks on, 2 off in the Gulf. And I kind of was like, I don't know if that's for me or not. So I ended up traveling in Latin America. So headed down to Mexico, kind of backpacking and hitchhiking and things like that. By a circuitous route, I ended up getting a job working for a non-governmental organization, an NGO in Guatemala. So it was called NRECA, National Rural Electrification Cooperative Association, which was a Roosevelt-era alphabet group that started kind of in Depression kind of thing. And after we were electrified, it went international. So, and again, I'd been kind of fairly, within a bubble on the East Coast, and then went to Colorado, and been around the U.S., but never really done a lot of stuff international. And in this case, we worked. A little bit of background: Guatemala had a pretty gnarly revolution that went from like the 50s all the way up through. I think the peace was in '96, and I got there in '97. And really, the way that a lot of these revolutions work is that the lowlands was kind of where kind of the Spanish really were, and it was what they had, the Ladino population, the mixed race population, that really drove it. And then up in the hills there was like Mayan Indians, and that the wars and the war there was really between the lowlands and kind of the more established, integrated, and then the higher kind of and the Indians up in the hills. So the program or the group that I worked with was kind of part of Peace Through Progress kind of development funds. And so we would go up into the rural indigenous areas, and they had not really been studied kind of in the period of time since the revolution or since the wars. And we did socioeconomic and topographical surveys of the towns to help them electrify. And so we got to go you got to see places that lived, as they did probably 500 years ago, with Indians that we'd have to bring translators to translate from the local language, a Mayan language, into Spanish. And so it was quite an experience for me. You mentioned about reading Shakespeare and stuff. A lot of time off. So I was either studying Spanish or reading Hemingway and Shakespeare and history, or just whatever I could get my hands on during that time. So after I did that for about a year and a half, which was a really cool experience. We go out in the hills and not have contact with kind of the major, no electricity, no nothing, for weeks at a time, riding horses to villages. And
sounds so frontiersy. So how would you contrast that educational experience to your time in Colorado?
As dramatic an educational experience, but just on totally different kind of dimensions. I had no sense for how the other half lives, for lack of a better term, seeing like true abject poverty and what that means to people. Seeing how, you could actually tell walking through some of these villages if there was a church or something involved, like basic things, like they would have a plastic drum to capture the water versus literally a hole dug in the ground to capture the water during the rainy season. Certainly, I got to learn Spanish and got to see the interactions and how people kind of, to that day, kind of like how the kind of middle class or urban populations viewed the people in the hills, and what true racism looks like. So like just really getting a sense for the how the world works outside of kind of really the kind of the Western bubble that I'd always existed in.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a time for some of our younger listeners of like major kind of the internet boom, so to speak, is the late 90s. So yep. It's pets.com, it's LinkedIn. I mean, it's GeoCities. I mean, like this is really kind of like the start of a massive wealth creation, at least in America. And then you're living such a different life from that.
Yep.
And then, how did you then kind of readjust?
Yeah, well, so I came back to the States, and culture shock is not, you don't get culture shock when you go to a place. You get culture shock when you come back home and you've had all these crazy experiences that it's hard to talk to people about, because there's just not any kind of commonality on which you have the thread. So when I came back to the States, went back to Maryland, worked for my dad for a little while to save money, again, decided that I didn't want to do that. Had an opportunity to go work in Europe, in Switzerland on another engineering job. And I'd interacted enough with other kind of Europeans and other things, other nationalities in my time abroad, to say, like, you know what, I really am an American. And I feel like if I go abroad right now, I'll probably be taking myself on a different path than what I want to do. But I don't want to work for my dad. So my brother and I were like, all right, this might be the last adventure. So my brother and I decided we were going to ride our bicycles across the country. So he and I got together.
Had you trained with Lance Armstrong? Like what made you think you could embark on this feat?
Well, one is just kind of I'm going to do it, and then I figure we had from Maryland to Ohio to train, and then Ohio the rest of the way out to actually do the ride.
The first 1,500 miles, that's just training.
Yeah, that's right. Although interestingly, you think about we rode from DC to Seattle. The Appalachian Mountains are kind of the smaller mountains in the country, but the roads were built there. They're built on Indian paths that were then paved, that became cart paths that were then paved. So you're kind of all up and down, and so it was just grueling riding. So the first chunk of it was way more challenging than what I thought. Turns out the Cascades and the Rockies are actually fairly straightforward because they're nice graded. You just kind of go up and go down. But yeah, so that's how we moved to. So we rode 3,600 miles in 38 days, and then unsupported. So just kind of like, and there weren't really touring bikes of that. So we just got mountain bikes and put on slick tires and panniers and camped and rode and got to Seattle. Then I took the train down to California. I'd had some friends that lived in Newport Beach that from School of Mines are like, hey, come down here. You can live on the beach and get a real job. So I was like, that's where I was heading. And you mentioned, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking, like, I get saddle sores from riding a Peloton for a half hour. I'm like, my we don't need to get into specifics, but my body would not have tolerated that ride. So you're literally like riding thousands of miles, going through like, up and down mountains, and then you end up in Newport Beach. So go ahead.
Yeah. With all the clothes that I brought, all the clothes that I had showing up in Newport Beach, I had probably had with me in Guatemala, and they've been in my saddlebag. So showing up the first time in a pair of khakis, like a t-shirt with yellows underneath the arms and holes in my khakis, where I think people didn't quite know what to make of me.
You're like, where are all the ladies at?
Yeah, and let me tell you about me living with Indians in Guatemala. They're like, yeah, I don't know.
They're like, okay.
What kind of car do you drive? But you mentioned it was the late 90s, and that was a big part of the reason I came to California. I knew the tech stuff was happening out here, and people have been coming to California to dig for gold for a long time now.
Yeah.
And so it seemed very much along those lines, the promise of beautiful weather and great opportunities.
So you brought your pickaxe, but it was a knowledge of what was like your, we'll call it marketable skill at this time. I mean, you went to Guatemala, you had a background in numbers, but what did you know how to do that people wanted?
Really, I had my degree in electrical engineering, so I had a readily employable skill. It was it was a good job market in the late 90s. The tech stuff was ramping up. And so I just started applying for engineering jobs. My degree was pretty broad, electronics, from electronics all the way up to, high voltage electrical, and applied for just about everything that I could find. Actually got out the white pages back then because, again, Monster wasn't around or what have you, and just started.
You didn't go to Indeed and ask for, send out your resume to 1,000 people at once.
Yeah, the other thing I ran into is no one knew what School of Mines was. It's good school, but out here they're like, well, you didn't go to USC? I don't understand. Like, so. Yeah.
What frat were you in?
Yeah. So, but in the course of calling, I got in touch with an electronics design consulting firm run by Dr. Howard Jelenic, who had connections into the School of Mines, knew it, so I said, hey, I'm applying, and I was asking for about half of what everybody else is asking, and he hired me on the spot to do. And his background, he was like a JPL Rockwell guy, kind of the old Southern California aerospace era, and he did a widget design for hire. So somebody would come off the street with an idea for a product. He, and by extension, we would design electronic device, put the embedded software on there, and give them everything they needed to produce it. And so we weren't involved in sales or marketing or anything like that. We were just involved in development of the products.
Okay. So you were hired, you undercut yourself, which, maybe that's a good strategy. If people are asking for X, ask for X divided by 2. But you didn't stay as an employee forever. Why not?
No, again, it was the dot-com era. So, kids with computers were going public, and kind of, I thought thought myself shouldn't be much different. So it was kind of like, hey, and I met one of the engineers that was working. Who's a super talented engineer. I realized very quickly that I was not a good engineer. Like I didn't have the attention span for it or the sense of craft. I appreciated it, but very quickly I moved from actually, heads down coding or on the oscilloscope and soldering. I moved more towards commercial, like customer facing activities. But I got to work with a guy named Ralph Mason, who's a very, very talented engineer. And so we were like, hey, let's start a company. What should we do? Kind of in that order.
Okay.
And but the environment was really good for that. So because we got to play around with a lot of early stage technologies, and a lot of things were really coming on the market at that point in time. So we had done a lot of projects with text to speech and voice recognition. So this is before a digital assistant. We actually built a digital assistant for blind people at that point, like a Palm Pilot at that era for blind people.
Very cool.
Yeah, we did audio encoding and decoding. So this is before iPods and before really even MP3s were kind of a standard. In fact, there was a guy who spun out a company just as I was coming on that was really focused on digitizing radio studios and stuff, because they were still vinyl and CDs. And then we started doing projects with GPS and wireless data. So we had we started working with at the era, like GPS had come out. Again, this is another thing I know way more about now than I did then. GPS came out, was declassified in the first Gulf War, but it had this thing called selective availability on it, which made it inaccurate. It had a jitter that was on purpose to restrict civilian uses. That had just been removed right when we started working on it, and so it was high accuracy. And there was a bunch of new cellular networks, wireless data networks that you could actually do data on. So the idea was to do GPS over data to a server and then help companies track their vehicles, is the idea. And we started working on that in 99, 2000, kind of working at night. So we bill hours consulting during the day and work on the projects at night, the company at night, and then eventually we spun that out in late 2000.
So you spun it out in late 2000. I mean, why didn't you just put .com at the end of it and go public and live on a yacht? But I think we were a little bit too late for that. That was the plan. I mean, for sure, that was the plan. Yeah, so, I mean, you should have been retired by then in .com years. But go ahead.
Well, the name of the company was Telogis, and the only reason why it was that name is because that .com domain was available. We just wrote like 1,000 different variations on words, and at that time, there's Accenture and Verizon and Singular. All these companies were rebranded. We need a name that sounds like something but is nothing. And so we wrote a bunch of words that were like that and just checked to see if the domain was available. And Telogis was available, so we got Telogis.com and then spun it out. But that era, the initial plan was to raise a ton of venture capital and do whatever we're going to do. But we were just 6 months too late by the time we got in the market. By the time we started raising, a couple of VCs had offices here in Orange County. They'd all pulled out. Even the Bay retrenched. And if you look back, it was a fairly prolonged drought in venture capital. Things were just not getting funded for a couple of years.
You couldn't get $20 million to spend on pool tables for your office?
No, and back then, that's not what people spent money on. They raised big money, but if you think about what it took to set something up, in our case, we had hardware, so you'd have to actually finance hardware and inventory and stuff like that. But even just doing a website, you had to go buy Sun, Oracle, IBM WebSphere. You had to buy a bunch of stuff. So you were looking at $1 million to set up a website, just in hard costs out the door to get something going. So a lot of that first year of venture capital went to hard costs. The pool tables came much later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So yeah. So that was kind of the year, and what it pulled out. You had to go buy your server. You had to go rent a rack somewhere. You had to pay for the internet to come in. And then you had to develop the software on top of it. And everything was unstable at that point. So if you wanted to be redundant, you had to do that yourself as a company. So there was real costs in just doing something very basic at that point in time.
Interesting. So you started this company where you actually had to manage inventory and do work. It wasn't the day where you can just get like a Squarespace website. And it lasted for a long time. And you operated primarily in California. Is that true?
We were fairly distributed pretty early on. So, okay. So Ralph, my former employer, had gotten his PhD in Christchurch, New Zealand, and he'd kept in touch with the University of Canterbury down there. And Ralph, my co-founder, was actually living in New Zealand at the time. Kind of interesting fact. There was a bunch of .com funded VoIP services at that time. So long distance calls had been $2-3 a minute, but we were able to kind of work for free on free VoIP, which was kind of new. So even a year or two before that, we would have spent probably thousands of dollars in phone bills. So we got, I guess in that sense, we were indirectly subsidized by venture capital. So we started hiring engineers in New Zealand, and up here was all the commercial stuff in California.
Okay. So, well, thank you, Ralph. Way to leverage your international contacts. What was the business climate like? And I don't want to make it too like internet-y, but what is it like, kind of just bare bones, Newth, like running a business in the 2000s in California? What was the good and bad of it?
Yeah. So let's see, we were pretty loose on things like labor and employment and taxes and stuff like that. So we kind of just went through the, if we're going to make it, we'll clean all that stuff up. And if not, then, who cares,
Yeah.
So we, the early days, we were pretty lean for the first few years. We weren't hiring, we weren't out functioning like a real business. So quickly, another thing to point in mind is that we're early in terms of technology. So if you think about what we had to do, we were selling, just one data point. So right after we started the company, my colleague or classmate from the Colorado School of Mines, Jason Cook, joined us. And so it was kind of Jason, Ralph, and I that really kind of did the work these first few years. And we would, we're selling technology to a plumber who's got his name on his shirt, and so in the early 2000s, like, okay, so here's these things called, there's these satellites and this GPS, and they tell you where you are, and you will communicate, but you can't communicate across those satellites. We're going to have a cell phone in the vehicle, but it's not really a cell phone you can talk on. The GPS is going to go over that to a server that we have.
Like, well,
and then we're gonna have to
slow down, geek boy. How does this help me?
Yeah, and then we're gonna have to, you and your warehouse can see where your guys are. Oh, you don't have a computer. We have to get a computer, and you have to get AOL, and so like just all the stuff that was there that was needed was really immature. But we're engineers, and so we kind of sold whatever we could along the way. It's just kind of really bootstrap the company in the biggest sense of the word. So as an example, an RFP came out to deploy a system with Bell South in Venezuela. Venezuela was still kind of a rich oil country at that point, and vehicle theft was a big problem. We don't have that problem in the U.S., so we were selling our system on the value proposition of, reduced fuel and, better, customer service, et cetera. Whereas down there, it's like, we'll get your car back. And
it's kind of like the LoJack of Venezuela, sounds like.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And so we ended up getting selected for that. As part of deploying that system, we needed to figure out a way to draw maps in Venezuela. So we developed a mapping engine that we put out in the market. And then BAE Systems, which is a big systems integrator, found us online and said, I'm building a system for the FBI. I need to know how much this costs. And we're like, I don't know, $1 million.
It's a lot. It's a lot of dollars.
$1 million. And they're like, fine, okay. And then so we had a wire from them. We're involved in the FBI's first kind of a vehicle tracking thing that was built in our mapping engine that we developed. And that was first contact with BA to $1 million wire from the FBI in like 60 days, which just doesn't happen if you interact with the federal government. So we had a number of events like that kind of really kind of kept us going while the industry matured. while, warehouses got wired with internet, while people bought computers, digital mapping and things like that came online. What we now know as software, we were software as a service from day one before that was a word, because we had to manage all these pieces of hardware that were, unreliable out in the field. So that became more common. So a lot of the stuff really matured around us.
Okay, so you were SaaS before it was cool. So
that's right.
Did you ever think, why don't we just sell pet food online? This would be a lot easier.
Yeah, that stuff all died in the late 90s. So, it turned out as a good idea again in 2021, but it was a bad idea back then. So, we had to solve real business problems. It was a healthy time in that sense that tech rationalized. And so you had to really, work hard for your customers and make sure you were, providing them value.
Well, you're a good case study in, I guess, being nimble. It's not as if you wrote this business plan in the early 2000s and followed it to a T. You're kind of like, all right, well, this customer is asking for this, so we're going to figure it out on the fly, and you succeeded. So hats off to you. But in anticipation of you coming on this program, Newth, I did some homework, and because you've done business, and at the peak of the company you started, how many people approximately did it employ?
By the end, you mean? We were probably around 450 employees.
Wow. Okay. So I expect the Matt Balaker podcast to be a 10-figure enterprise any month now. And I don't know if I'll employ that many people, but I want to learn from your experience. So here's some stats I'm going to throw out. According to a research institute at Stanford University, the rate of businesses leaving California in 2021 was twice that of 2020 and 3 times the rate in 2018. We've heard some big names like Oracle, Tesla, Hewlett Packard, Charles Schwab. These companies, it's not as if they don't do any business here, but many of their headquarters are no longer here, or lots of their personnel have moved elsewhere. I'm just reading stats. I didn't really run businesses. How does that strike you when you hear stats like that, Newth?
It's not surprising. And I think there's a push and a pull, right? Certainly you can look at California politics and say there's a taxing rates and all PAGA laws and all kinds of other stuff, and say that the state's pushing out. But there's also a pull in that, because of virtualization, you can do more all over the place. The cluster effect, which is that if you look at the Bay Area, there's the tech companies certainly, but then there's the workers, there's the service providers, there's everything around there that you need to start a business. And that's what, and Houston has a cluster around, petrochemicals or what have you. But with kind of the availability of virtual environments, you can do that stuff in Nashville or Austin or Boulder or wherever, and tap some of the expertise that would be back in the Bay. And then as more and more of that stuff diffuses from the Bay Area, then they start kind of getting micro clusters in other areas. And certainly cost of living factors in. If whether you're raising money to hire people or you're doing out of profits, either way, it's a limited pool of capital, and that has to be deployed, and you got to pay that to your employees, and they in turn have to pay mortgages and put kids in school and buy eggs and all the other stuff that they have to do. So the dollar just goes a longer way. And so it's a push and a pull on both sides.
Yeah. And what you're talking about, Newth, is kind of the historic infrastructure California has. Obviously, it's a beautiful climate. It's a tourist destination. You and I live here, and there's probably no state aesthetically I'd rather be in, but probably 20, 30 years ago, you'd say, all right, there's biotech in San Diego. There's hospital, and even Los Angeles has a great aerospace industry. Go up north. I mean, you go to Silicon Valley, and they've funded essentially half the tech companies or more of the last 30, 40 years. But it sounds like what worked in the past may not work for the future, and there's just a point where people can't afford it. Like I was looking at some of the states that these businesses were leaving to. The top was Texas by far, followed by Florida and Tennessee. What do you think it is about some of those states that attract businesses?
I think cost is a big one. They also have pretty good, particularly in the case of Texas and Florida, they have pretty good university systems. So there's a talent pool that's coming out, which is an area where California was definitely kind of that, I think, a notch above most of the other university systems. So I think a lot of that is caught up. So not just the current labor pool and the ability to go virtual, but kind of that there's the promise of having a continued crops of talent that are coming out. So I think that's a big part of it that's out there. I mean, housing and then commute coupled on top of that, cost of housing and the impacts of having to spend an hour in a car each way. That's a big hit. It's a big ask for somebody. If you think you're putting an additional 20% uncompensated cost on their day, right? For just get back to work.
So I know Elon Musk got a lot of grief when he moved headquarters from California to Texas. Now that you're kind of on the other side, Newth, where you're looking to fund companies or you might be giving guidance to entrepreneurs, what would be a reason, in your opinion, to start a business in California?
Well, the weather's good. I certainly started a second business here in California, although it's a little bit different in that it's we're venture capital, so everybody's kind of finance professional, highly compensated, etc. So you can kind of be have an office in Newport Beach, live very close, and it's likely that most of the people we intend to hire will be there. Mm-hmm. If you hire a business that needs more kind of a more stratified workforce, kind of hourly frontline people all the way up through middle management, that's a much more difficult thing to do here and to scale out, at least in the coastal areas. And then if you go inland, then you really ask the question, what's the difference between inland California and Phoenix?
Taxes, probably.
Yeah, probably taxes, right? There's a net benefit on the other side. A lot of the businesses that we look at, the entrepreneur is there first and then funds the business. So they're not really making decisions to look at a business. But that said, a business that's more at scale and is really looking at these kinds of things, you'd have to really have something special to put California on top of that list, and that the list of what is unique in California, apart from mountains and beaches, is getting more and more narrow by the day, I think, as other areas are getting built up.
That's a good point. And I imagine Gavin Newsom listens to this program. I'm not sure if he's a subscriber, but I know his friends suggest it. And as do other, influential people out there. And say you had a magic wand, Newth, and your goal was to make California a more business-friendly environment, and you didn't have to kind of go through the usual legislative steps. What are, a few semi-realistic things that you would want to see enacted?
So, man, where do you start on this? It's kind of like a death by 1,000 cuts thing. It's like every time you turn around, there's one more thing. I've got some of my friends that run businesses that are not necessarily in tech. They've all been hit with PAGA lawsuits. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this is that this is the knock-on effect of having all the rules and regulations is that the state doesn't really have a big enforcement capability, right? There's not like the ADA police that are out there running around making sure your bathrooms are right. So what the state has essentially done is delegated this to the tort lawyers. And so there's we're always
I'm shivering, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, it is shivering like that. And I know a number of people that have been hit by really kind of wage theft type lawsuits that are driven by tort lawyers. And they're entrepreneurs. Everything's done on contingency, and so they go around anybody that has paid, that pays by the hour, and is like, "Did your guys punch out for break?" And I don't know exactly how it's calculated, but for sure you're going to fund some kind of picayune kind of violation of this, even if you don't, the intention was right, and then all of a sudden you're exposed for all these damages and you can understand the intention to the laws. You don't want people taking advantage of low income employees or hourly employees. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the spirit of the laws was not to enrich a bunch of tort lawyers.
No.
And that happened happens in a number of areas. So you can imagine any regulation that makes your life more difficult and then tack on predatory legal system. It's kind of adding insult to injury and just kind of one more thing where any one of these things you could survive and what have you, but you get hit by them all the time. At some point, you just throw up your hands and go, I'm going to go somewhere where people want me to employ people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's as if there's almost like an animosity towards businesses. It feels like it's like instead of them being an enterprise that creates a solution or makes a better product or somehow improves the quality of life, they're simply a function to squeeze tax revenue or to fund other pet projects like tort lawyers.
Yeah, it's a conscious effort to delegate to it. That is their enforcement mechanism, and of course, and then it gets in a vicious cycle where the tort lawyers become big donors because they're benefiting, and so we're going to pass this regulation. How do we enforce it? The lawyers will enforce it. So I was in. I happened to be in during the election when Bernie Sanders looks like he was going to win or he was doing well. I happened to be in Denmark, and we met with some political folks over there, and it was kind of like this big, this thing, we've got the cow and it's our economy and all this great, thing, Legos and, milk and cheese and all these other things. And then the milk is the social system for the, for the people. He said, problem is we're killing the cow. And so at the time when our politics were ramping up on saying this, this is the way of the future, over there, they're pulling it back down and saying like, look, we're just starving the economy. And so no matter how, that we're the real economy that creates the wealth that allows us to do these other things, we really are hurting. And so I think that's what's happening in California.
Yeah, I mean, I'm stating the obvious, but it's private enterprise that's the engine of growth. It's not tax money that is creating jobs. I mean, it creates bureaucracy which can employ people, but all of those stem from people creating an idea, taking a risk, and working to execute the idea. Basically, a bunch of Newth Morrises out there. So I hope, Gavin, if you're listening, maybe make it a little business friendlier. In the long run, maybe some of these companies might move back. We've got good weather, lots of other perks here. So now that you're funding investments and you're helping other people, what are some kind of principles that you want to see in businesses that you help grow?
Well, we're coming in a time now where there's essentially a tech recession on right now. It's hard to tell if the real economy is in recession. You can look at job stuff. You can look at the jobs numbers, and who knows what's really going on. The Fed's figuring this out. But certainly there's a recession going on in tech. And there's probably too much money that came out in the back half of 2020 and 2021. But even in the 18 and 19 era, there was just a lot of money going into technology, and money was really easy. And you could look at the Twitter videos and stuff like that and see how much productive work was being done. I think it's really important that we're entering an environment where there probably will be more funding that comes online, but it's going to be a lot more disciplined. And so right now we look for companies that are solving real problems and are really focused on customer problems. My drum that I like to beat is you build a company is like a product. It's like a machine. It's designed to do a few things really well and efficiently. Where I think there was so much bloat that and I think what Elon Musk saw at Twitter was that if we're not doing what we need to do well, and so you can actually focus, do a more targeted goal, be more responsive to your customer in the market, and use less resources and be more efficient in the way that you use resources. So that's one thing that we look for, particularly now. There's when I was starting my business, there was still a sense that founders were something you needed to clean up. You needed to bring in the gray hairs, push them out, and let the gray hairs take over. I think that kind of changed with Zuckerberg and Larry and Sergey, and it became more like you need a mentor and stuff like that, which is definitely the environment now. There's a widespread belief that founders are willing to crawl over glass to get things done, and so you need to support them and supplement them. As part of that, they need to know what they don't know, which you get a headstrong. By definition, you start a company, you're pretty headstrong and probably naively so. So you need someone who's willing to learn and listen. and also kind of in a weird way, not be threatened, because if you are hiring people that are good at their jobs, they're going to be better at what they do than you are. They're,
Right.
but you need to be able to have enough humility to hire and then delegate, but then also align, right? Not just because someone's done it before doesn't mean it's going to work in your environment. So they need to be led in such a way that their skills are useful in the new endeavor.
Well said. So, you've had probably 20 plus years of business experience. What are you most proud of business-wise that you've done?
The best thing I've done is attracting great partners. And so, there's early on Jason and Ralph and Telogis, and then later on a couple people like Dave Cousins who came on. We brought him on as eventually became CEO. And then even my new environment, my new partners, Brian Messick and John Sharmson and Jared Smith. For me, that's the most important thing, is to work with people that are good at what they do, that are able to realize what they do well and what everybody else does well, and to get everybody rolling in the same direction. Some people are wired to do it all and kind of be more kind of like the head man in charge. And I'm kind of more of a collaborative kind of guy. So I think just being able to work with the right people over the time has been probably my most lucky part in building businesses.
Like the old saying, you can do it all, but you can't do it all yourself. So get a good team.
That's right. And there's no, if you dig into any founder story, for every Steve Jobs, there's a Wozniak somewhere in the story. Now, if you really dig, and one of the things we look at companies, every now and then you get a guy's like, I did it all. And if you double click on it, now maybe it went bad and there's lawsuits or whatever, but there's always somebody else that's there. So. Nice.
Well, we're wrapping up, but I want to know, and the listeners do, what are you most optimistic about, Newth?
I'm very optimistic in general about things. I mean, it's easy to look around, particularly if you're on Twitter or reading the news, like, the world's falling apart and what have you. And, you mentioned the California politics. I mean, that might take a generation to play out. Who knows? But, we still have Texas. So, but in general, if you look at all the, the true, measurements of how we're doing as a society, I mean, we're everybody's healthier, everybody's living longer, we're growing. Even on some of the environmental things, for better or for worse, it seems like population decline will be a bigger issue before any of the true catastrophic environmental stuff kicks in. That's going to cause its own set of problems, but we're not going to be living in Soylent Green anytime soon. I'm kind of a pro-democracy, pro-market guy, and it seems like these other models of how to run things are being discredited, although that might make them more dangerous in the short term. But I think, I do feel that, kind of to bring it back in this environment, it kind of feels like we're on the cusp of like another kind of step function in some of the technology things. My era was the internet, and it became kind of mobile, and now we've got kind of some of the machine learning stuff that'll further accelerate kind of technology. In my mind, what all these digital technologies do is just remove friction factors from the economy. If you one person stamping documents to automating that just makes everything smoother and go at less cost. So I think we're coming in to that. And then in the real stuff, bits and atoms and stuff like that, going to Mars would be pretty cool. And if it's sustainable or not, who knows? But maybe we'll just get there and decide it's not worth doing it again for another 50 years. But it's definitely within the realm of achieving.
So to Mars and beyond, Newth. So for people out there who maybe have a few extra billion and they are like, I want to deploy it to some SaaS companies, or I don't know what to do with myself. What advice do you have for them? Where can they learn about you, or maybe some of the stuff you're doing?
So Ankona.com, Ankona.com. That's our website. And then my email is newth@ankona.com, NEWTH.
Well, thank you, Newth Morris, and please come back. We really appreciate having you.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Matt Balaker Podcast. To learn more, please check out mattbalaker.com and encourage your friends to like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate it.